Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Pehchaan. This happens to be a birthday month for both Amreen and I. And I don't know about you guys, but every time it's the beginning of my birthday month, I go through an existential crisis or a midlife crisis. I'm like, what am I doing with my life? Am I doing the right things? And this year, it's been particularly interesting because both Amreen and I are running two media or news platforms between Pehchaan and Central Desi, and we're both exhausted and excited. So we thought maybe we'd bring Anam in to help us figure out our midlife crisis because she's done some very similar work to us and had perhaps has a lot to teach us or to warn us. We'll find out as we sort of get into the podcast. Anam Khan is one of the most extraordinary characters when it comes to Pakistani news in the US. She started a Pakistani news startup called NewsRun, and for a moment, it really captured the zeitgeist of the Pakistani diaspora in terms of providing nonpartisan news, which nonpartisan in Pakistan is really hard to say in the same sentence, but nonpartisan news in a bite-sized format. So instead of being one of those uncles who's watching 40 minutes of YouTube shows while they're exercising on the treadmill next to you, this was really sort of bite-sized content. And what was remarkable was even people I knew who were not interested in news were up to date on the news run. So it was almost category breaking in terms of what it was able to provide. And then the news run and Anam took their own twists and turns. Anam is wears multiple hats and has done multiple things. She's also a communications and content strategist, so we'll sort of get a little bit into that as well. And we'll also talk about her backstory and life story, her Pehchaan, growing up between Pakistan and the US in the shadow of 9/11 and what that was like. So there's a lot to it. Let's get into it. Anam, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we're really excited to get into all of it with you. As you can tell, there's a little bit of an existential crisis at our end as well. But maybe I want to start by talking about your life from the beginning and really trying to understand who you are as a person before we come to the birth of the news run. Talk to me a little bit about what your childhood was like and where you were growing up. I understand you grew up a little bit in Pakistan, a little bit in the US, but talk to us what childhood, what growing up was like, where you were doing your growing up.
So I spent most of my childhood in Lahore, Pakistan. Uh, Ever since I started nursery, I was in one school, Lahore American School, and I stayed there until high school. And then I graduated. And then after graduation, I went to Massachusetts for college, Smith
Hmm.
College. Spent 4 years there. And then I moved to New York, got some very entry level work experience at a startup in the city. And it was an information services startup. And I was a marketing associate for them. And then I went on to graduate school in New York City as well. I did a master's in strategic communications from Columbia University. And then I also, while I was doing my grad school program, a part of that program was also having us intern at a communications role in New York City. It was a requirement for the program to do that.
Hmm.
And instead of just doing it for the summer, that was actually like the standard amount of time we had to do the internship. I ended up staying on at 6 months at CNN and their
Wow.
relations department because I just
Hmm.
enjoyed it so much. So I was going to school and completing my degree and also interning at the same time. And luckily, my degree gave me the flexibility to schedule my classes so that I could work during the day and then go to classes closer to the evening.
Hmm.
Uh, so I really appreciated that experience as well. And just to rewind again, even while I was growing up in Pakistan, I came to New York a lot with my family for holidays and trips ever since I was a kid. So I've been going back and forth between the US and Pakistan for most of my life, even if I wasn't actually living or studying in the US at that time.
Yeah. I think there's this meme about this Pakistani actor, right, who's like, I'm here and there, or something to that effect, between, I think it's Anam Khan. So you grew up sort of here and there. What was that like, sort of going back and forth? And did I recall correctly that you went to Lahore American School?
Yeah.
Is that correct? And so, what was that subculture like? So, talk to me a little bit about that.
I mean, I guess at the time it felt pretty natural to me because that's the only exposure I'd had in
Mm-hmm.
Lahore. I didn't really socialize that much outside of school, and I was also in one school for a big chunk of my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
So I did kind of feel like I was in a little bubble uh,
Mm-hmm.
with my LAS community, and I really enjoyed going to school there and the academics and growing up there. And it felt like a pretty natural fit for me because I always knew, and my parents always knew that I was going to go to college in the States eventually. So
Mm-hmm.
studying in the American system felt like the option that made the most sense.
Yeah.
So I feel like adjusting to academics and studying abroad after going to LAS was pretty seamless.
Mm-hmm.
And like I really like how the education at LAS also really encourages extracurriculars and creativity, both the arts and sciences. So I feel like it did help me prepare for the next chapter of my life after high school, for sure.
That makes a lot of sense. And then I'm assuming, sort of, when you came to the US to study, there probably wasn't a lot of culture shock. There probably, and I'm assuming this, you tell me, but I'm assuming you probably came in and it felt like a continuation, or did it feel different? Like, what was that like?
I guess actually I did feel a bit of a culture shock just because I also grew up in Pakistan in a very sheltered environment. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't go out that much. Like my life was between school and going home and like going to a few friends' places. But college life in America is very different from whatever I
Mm-hmm.
had experienced in uh, Pakistan. Much, it was very liberal. So in
Mm-hmm.
that sense, I did experience a culture shock because
Mm-hmm.
there was just a very, like, it was just a very different vibe. Like a lot of partying, an entirely different level of socializing, like a whole other extreme that I hadn't really witnessed before or experienced when I was growing up in Pakistan. So, in that sense, it was a culture shock. But in terms of adjusting to general life in the States and like communicating with people there and adjusting to studying there, that wasn't so much of a challenge for me. It was more of I think the challenges are more social than anything else.
That's so fascinating because there's like a double identity sort of play here where you would, the things that you would box sort of somebody from LAS into, to say, hey, it's a very liberal school, there's a lot of socialization, there's a lot of partying. It's interesting that then when you move to the US, you sort of say those things about sort of the university that you were in. And so, what was that like from an identity standpoint? Sort of, did you at that point in time think that, hey, I'm different? Or was it just more of, you were a young girl at that point, it was just about sort of fitting in and adjusting? Like, is that sort of, how did your identity and sort of those things play in as you were sort of settling into that social part and sort of getting used to life here?
But I feel like one thing I always wanted to do, like, and I mentally prepared myself for this before going to
Mm-hmm.
college, was to just strike a balance.
Mm-hmm.
Stay true to the person I was when I lived in Lahore and true to my values, but also keep an open mind and eh, be accepting of people who might have values different from mine and not
Mm-hmm.
shut down myself completely or shut other people out just because their beliefs and values are slightly different from mine. So I didn't really want to go out of my way to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And because I think that would require me trying to change who I am and become a different person. I think I just kind of wanted to merge with the new community and society that I was in at my new college and embrace different things about the American culture in terms of its progressiveness, but at the same time also always remind myself that, I grew up very differently. I'm originally from Pakistan. My family's from there, and I don't want to lose that part of myself
Mm-hmm.
either. So, like, I just had a very open-minded live and let live mentality that I've
Mm-hmm.
tried to maintain for most of my life, like even after college.
That's fascinating. And there's another dimension that I also sort of want to bring here, which is I'm assuming this was sort of post 9/11, but a few years after sort of 9/11. How was that? Like, was that still a factor sort of at the back of people's minds, at the back of your mind as you were sort of getting into school, or did you not feel sort of that as something sort of a thread that was sort of behind the scenes in terms of how Muslims or Pakistanis might be viewed as you came here?
I mean, personally, I didn't experience anything that made me feel like um, I was being threatened or the Pakistani Muslim community on campus was under any kind of threat or that the campus wasn't being inclusive of us in any way. But maybe somebody else
Mm-hmm.
had a different experience. I'm just speaking to what I observed. But
Mm-hmm.
I think Smith College is also a very unique kind of campus. Like it was pretty ahead of its time in terms of being a very liberal environment, in terms of like, and socially and academically as well. So, and it really went out of its way to be an inclusive campus. So, but then again, I feel like that's definitely not a reflection of what other students from
Mm-hmm.
Pakistan or other Muslim students were experiencing elsewhere in America. I
Yeah.
think that again was its own little bubble in Massachusetts of all states. So
Yeah. That's very true. It was a very liberal and progressive sort of bastion where you were at. So this is very interesting. Now, walk me through how you go from here as somebody who's come from Pakistan to Smiths, and then how this leads to you being the founder of the NewsRun sort of a few years later. Like, how is that idea born, sort of in context of sort of your life experiences that happen over the next few years?
it's a really good question. It's I think a big part of it was really about me like, always trying to keep some part of Pakistan with me, even though I was living abroad for so long. And so, like I said, after college, I worked in New York for a couple of years, and I did grad school, and then I did go back to Pakistan for about a year and a half or 2 years after grad school, just to be closer to my family and also like see like experience working in Lahore as well because I had only ever gone to school there. So
Mm-hmm.
I was looking for a different kind of experience in Lahore. And then I moved back to the States. And then when I moved back, I I started to feel like I was very disconnected from what was
Mm-hmm.
happening in Pakistan. And I felt it more now than I did when I was much younger and going to college
Mm-hmm.
because when I was in in high school, my I think the way I was looking at the world was very different.
Mm-hmm.
I was just focusing on school. I was just a kid, and then when I went to college, like I didn't really feel the divide as much compared to when I did when I moved back to Pakistan for 2 years when I was much older and I'd had more experience and I was following the news more and events happening on the ground. Like my life just didn't revolve around high school or middle school at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I just felt more immersed in
Mm-hmm.
Lahore when I moved back after grad school. So then when I left again and went and
Mm-hmm.
came to the States, I started to feel like I didn't know anything that was happening in Pakistan. That was making me feel guilty. I missed having the local news all around me. It was really hard for me to find the right articles to read or like the news or news sites that I wanted to follow because so much of the news was very dense and the
Mhm.
articles were long and lengthy. And I just kept thinking that I wish someone could just give all this information to me and bite sized content
Mhm.
and just tell me the key things I need to know so that I don't have to spend so much time scouring different news sites and the
Mhm.
news, trying to make sense of what's happening in Pakistan. And a lot of the articles that I was reading were not giving a lot of context behind what they're
Mhm.
writing about. It's almost like they expected their audience to know what they're talking about, but that's not always the case, especially for
Mhm.
people living abroad. And I'd also been reading other American news outlets like The Skim or
Mhm.
Axios, and they had started this new model where they were
Mhm.
emailing bite-sized news content to people directly in their inbox, just highlighting the news they needed to know for the day. And I was really drawn to that model and that
Mhm.
style of smart brevity writing.
Mhm.
And then in my mind, I was like, why can't anyone do this in Pakistan? Like, it would
Mhm.
serve me so well. It would make it so much
Mhm.
easier for me to keep up with the news. And then I thought, okay, like I'd recently moved to DC. I was looking for a job,
Mhm.
but then I thought, I have time now. I'm still settling in here. And I'm not really finding something that's a good fit for me in DC because a lot of that is very government focused. So
Mhm.
then I thought, okay, maybe I'll start this project. Like, this is a great opportunity
Mhm.
to think of how I can kind of get inspiration from the other online newsletter models I'd seen in America, like the Skim and Axios, and try
Mhm.
to create something like that for Pakistani news. So that's like my long-winded way of explaining how the idea of the NewsRun was born.
That's quite an extraordinary story, and I have like two follow-up questions. But before that, I also want to say, hey, Amreen, welcome.
Hi.
Uh, Nice to have you in our party podcast today as well. And I guess we're all sort of, in some ways, have had the experience and the trauma of trying to run a new startup in the Desi space. So I think there's a lot of sort of bonding here to be done. But Anam, one thing that you said that's just caught me off guard is when you said you felt guilty after you moved back here, where you wanted to follow up with the news, but you felt like you couldn't. Why did you feel guilty? Um,
I still don't really know why. Like, I don't think I have a clear answer for that. I was just feeling like, there's this other country where I've spent so much of my life and I should know what's happening there, and I don't. So I think that was making me feel guilty. Like, just the and for some reason I associate being connected with the country with being connected with their news and what's happening on the ground and like political, social issues. And so I felt like I wanted to keep that part of my identity with me and preserve it while living in the States. And for some reason, following the news to me meant like keeping that part of my Pakistani identity close to me too.
yeah. I find that so fascinating, and it really strikes a nerve. It almost like I have goosebumps right now because, in some ways, I feel like I started Pehchaan to stay connected to my Pakistani identity, and I feel like Amreen started Central Desi to stay connected to her Desi identity. And I'm like, there's got to be an easier way to stay connected to our identity than starting a new startup, but there has to be an easier path. But it's so interesting that guilt. I don't know. I don't know if it's. I think I'm so happy that you said the word guilty because I don't think I've ever verbalized it. But that's maybe what I feel like I'm leaving Pakistan behind, and with my new identity, sort of moving here, and maybe that's what it is. So it's very profound as you sort of say that and give that a word. And Amrina, I'm also going to let you in. We've just sort of started talk. We talked a little bit about Anam's background, and now we're just beginning to get into the news run and how it was born. I'm still moved by the guilt part of it.
I think this is very different for me because I don't know that I feel any guilt. That's not really where I'm operating from. And I think it's because I never, like, I didn't really make a choice to leave Pakistan. I was a kid when I left. And so the choice was made for me. Um, I think there are times where I've like questioned my parents' decision and wondered why they made that choice, right? But it wasn't really something that had to like stay with me, that weighed me down. But I think that's so interesting because it must be so hard. I always think like as an adult to like have grown up in one place and then make a choice to build a life in another place. It just seems like such a difficult choice to make.
That's true. And I guess that's sort of what goes into that. And there's a second follow-up question that I also have, which is, it's one thing to feel like, okay, I want to feel more connected to Pakistan, I feel guilty, I want to stay connected to the news. It's another thing to realize this meta trend of sort of smart brevity and Axios, and that it's another thing to then say, I'm going to be the one that's going to do this. That's another leap of faith, to be like, I'm going to be the one that's going to try to make a difference here. What was that journey like where did that confidence, where did that chutzpah sort of come from when you took that leap?
I think it just came from me noticing that there was a gap, in the sense that, there is this whole other avenue of writing and distributing news out of Pakistan that hasn't been explored in a lot of depth yet. And I wanted to jump on it before anyone else does. So I guess that's where the main motivation came from.
Yeah. I think that's really smart. And I think that's what drove a lot of, like, I think between the three of us, I think that we share a lot of that as well. And was it, when you were starting it, did you feel like it was more the journalism part that you were trying to crack, or it was more the business model that you were trying to crack that would enable sort of like us to have like a model that could create something like this? Like, what was going through your mind as you were sort of beginning on this journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like the journalism aspect of it wasn't as hard to crack because I had a pretty solid idea of what writing style I wanted to establish for the NewsRun. So the words kind of just flowed out pretty naturally. And the way I did my research was just reading other news articles from mainstream and established news outlets that are either based in Pakistan or even international outlets reporting on news in Pakistan. And I just tried to summarize the content across different articles, and like I would add hyperlinks so people knew like where my sources were coming from, and then just give bite-sized recaps in a brief but also balanced way. I like calling it like a smart way to like help people follow, quick and smart. Smart breakdowns of Pakistan's top news. That was the NewsRun's tagline.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the harder part was, one, just trying to raise more awareness about it and market it to people and grow the newsletter subscriber base. And then also just trying to maintain a daily schedule of writing news every day, Monday to Friday, because it's very time consuming for one person to do all of that, like do the research, write the content, edit the content, fact check the content, and then also like build the email newsletter every day to send it out at a specific time. And then just trying to get it in front of people. So marketing it, which I think is a separate full-time job on its own. And also just figuring out how I could eventually monetize it. Because some people suggested I make it a subscription model, but I thought that almost went against what I wanted the NewsRun to stand for. I wanted it to be news that that people could read to make their lives easier. And if I put up a paywall, then it wouldn't be as accessible. Hence, it wouldn't really be making their lives easier because they wouldn't be able to access that news. So yeah, just trying to figure out like how to build a revenue stream from it as well, which also means reaching out to partners, like seeking out sponsorships. It's a lot for one person to do all of that.
Was that something you were able to crack? Were you able to start making revenue on it?
Not very consistently. So I think that's where I started to realize that, I would have to think a lot more about how the NewsRun is going to operate if I wanted to continue and grow, because I realized that I needed more resources and more investment and a much bigger team to be able to do that.
Yeah. It's something that I feel a lot of people who go into this type of work, it's a challenge that they face, is that you start by thinking, okay, I want to produce this news and I want to tell these stories, but then making it sustainable ends up becoming the biggest challenge, and really where you have to focus your energies. And there's sort of almost a tension between wanting to just produce the newsletter versus finding a way to make a business operate so that you can sustain it. Did you feel like, in the end, part of why you maybe stopped doing it was because that was hard to crack for you?
I think that is some part of it, definitely, because I didn't know if I myself could help the NewsRun reach its full potential. Like, I think it had a lot of potential. It just needed more people to be investing in it and working on it with me. And I wasn't able to sustain that realistically on my own. And in the long run, I thought that, if I deprioritize the quality of the writing and focus more on the business side, then that would also hurt the quality of the NewsRun, which is the last thing I wanted, because I had so much pride in the quality of writing and research that I did to put those newsletters together every day. So I wasn't willing to compromise that. So that's when, yeah.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I'm curious, in the months, or I guess maybe it's been over a year now since you paused, have you felt tempted to go back to it? Like, especially I'm thinking about, the news about Imran Khan, whether in moments like that, you wish that you had that platform to kind of speak out and share with others.
I really miss the NewsRun. Like, I'm missing it now more than ever, especially with the election around the corner in Pakistan. And I never really wanted to give my personal opinion about what I thought was happening politically on the ground. The purpose of the NewsRun was just to give people the facts as objectively as possible without letting my own personal opinions influence my writing. So I didn't want to tell people how to think or tell them what I was thinking about a certain political party or politician. Like, I just wanted to let them know what they needed to know, and then they can decide like how they want to interpret that, or they can decide how they feel about a specific politician who's headlining the news that day or something. But I really do miss the NewsRun. I feel like it's actually my calling to do that kind of work, but practically it's just hard to sustain.
Wow, that's something when you know that, right? Even if you can't do it right now, I think it's a gift to know what might feel like a calling, right? And there's always opportunities to find your way back to it. Maybe you got into this with Bilal before I came on, but what else do you kind of have going on in your life, and how does all of that feel? Does it feel like those are also things that sustain you, maybe in different ways? I think about how I have a lot of different streams of work going on right now, and how each one kind of, it's hard for me to let go of any of them because I value all of them a lot. I don't know if you can relate to that, but yeah, like, if this is your calling, are you doing other things that you feel like are just as valuable to you?
In some sense, so my full-time job is very different from what I was doing with the NewsRun. It involves writing, so that's one area of overlap, but I'm a content strategist for a technology company, and I do a lot of UX writing for them. So basically, just trying to communicate what certain technology products are offering to their audience, and like communicating how they work, how they function through writing. and just writing strings, and just also just trying to use writing to simplify the user experience for people using those products. So in some sense, I'm kind of bringing the smart and human voice of the NewsRun to technology, but like obviously the context is very different and it's not news related. Uh, so I like that I'm writing, but it's just in a very different capacity. Uh, and it's helped me, and I think it's really helped me grow as a professional and as a writer. And it's also helped me improve my technical aptitude. Like I don't have a background in technology, but now I'm working in technology, and I'm surrounded by really smart, talented people who I'm learning a lot from every day. So like, I still feel like I'm growing, and I feel proud of that. But I still miss the news.
Yeah, and I really want to go in back to that, back to the news run, and that's because I feel like this is a very rare moment. I feel like this is group therapy for sort of kindred spirits, and I want to talk about how lonely it is and sort of a love hate relationship with your passion. You call it a calling, Anna, which is really interesting. And I'm at a slightly different phase where I know this kind of work is my calling, but I also feel the burden of it. And I want to talk a little bit more about that because I don't think we can talk about it with anybody else. Like even like our spouses might not get it. And so this is a rare sort of spot where we can share. But Anama, like, was it lonely doing this work? And also, like, because you said I wish I had more people with me, and that's like kind of what I wish also, and why this is so special. But then the other relation is like when you're in it, you kind of love it, but you also hate it. But then when you stop doing it, you miss it. So talk to me a little bit about sort of the cocktail of emotions and how they were sort of underlaying you through this journey as you were going through this.
Yeah, yeah. So I feel like sometimes it felt lonely in the sense that, I was working on something that meant the most to me compared to anyone else. But I did have an opportunity to like hire some people who did help me out for a while with social media strategy and editing and writing. And they're great people, and I really enjoyed working with them. And I feel like they did lighten my burden in some way. But it was usually just two, three people at a time. And I appreciate that I got to experience that kind of a leadership role as well, because I feel like I've been able to transfer some of those skills to my current job. Uh, and it just gave me the confidence I needed to like maybe lead a project or an initiative or something at my current job, for example. So I feel like my experience with the newsrun is still helping me. But at the same time, like, I still needed more people to do
Mm-hmm.
like business building. Like I needed people to help me network with other companies. I needed people to help me build partnerships. But again, so much focus was on the editorial side, which I was constantly trying to perfect, that there we still were not growing as much as we needed to reach more people, maybe like have a subscriber base that's more attractive to investors, or just have a team that's consistently reaching out to brands for sponsorships and partnerships so that we could use that avenue to make more money and then keep hiring a bigger team and just grow. So I feel like that is where I I always had a gap, and
Yeah.
I was just not able to fill it. And I was paying for the news run out of pocket
Mm-hmm.
with my own salary, bootstrapping it. So there was just a point where like I had to take a step back and realistically think about how I was going to sustain the news run so that it becomes what I imagined it to be,
Hmm.
which is kind of why I ended up doing a hiatus and taking a step back, because I wanted to do the news run justice, and I feel like I wasn't doing that at the time.
And how much of that do you think was you talking to yourself and saying you're not doing it justice? And how much of it, because there was a moment where and I mentioned this in my intro, like you had really captured the zeitgeist. The news run was everywhere. People who were not interested in the news were like following the news run. and there was a moment, and oftentimes when we're in the middle of our thing, like I think like the only ones watching Pehchaan are like my parents, and that's not true. Amreen's parents watch them too, but like your internal monologue is so strong that you're like, oh, this is not working out, this is never going to get any traction, I should just stop it and move on to something else. um how much of this do you think was internal with you talking to yourself and not meeting your own standards versus you not meeting some, external sort of benchmark that you had?
Wait, before you answer that, can I share something? So I was reading this book about creativity last night, and it shared that anytime you take like a creative idea and you create it, you either write it down or you produce it or whatever, it immediately gets flattened because we're mortals, right? And we're creating with our own limitations and our own limitations of ability to express. So I was thinking about how a lot of what you were doing is building a community. That's what we do at Pehchaan. That's what we do at Central Daisy. We're building a community for people that are, no longer anchored to their home, and they want to come together. And that idea is so beautiful. But then anything you create that tries to do that will feel like it's not living up to the potential, right? Because there's so many limitations to what we're able to create. So I totally agree with this question. I'm curious how you'll answer it.
Yeah, it's actually, this conversation is giving me a chance to reflect on this a lot now after a while. But I think a lot of it was an internal monologue. I'm a perfectionist by nature, and especially, and if there's something I've created from the ground up, I want to make sure it's achieving its full potential. So I do feel like a big part of me was demotivating myself. And I actually didn't realize that there were people who appreciated the news run as much until I actually stopped working on it, because people have been emailing NewsRun's email account. They've been messaging us in our DMs on Instagram, asking where we are, when we're coming back. And then that's when I started to realize, oh wow, like people are actually noticing that we're not operating right now. It makes me feel both happy and sad at the same time, because then I feel like I want to start working on this again. But like now that I'm so busy with my other full-time job, and like I feel like I still don't have the resources I need to like help the newsroom grow into a fully functional, like established online news organization. I still feel like I'm a little stuck.
Isn't that sad? I mean, I just think like our community has so much wealth, like maybe not as much as other communities, but plenty, enough to fund a newsletter for sure. And there really isn't anything like that. To me, the news run was translating the world of Pakistani news, which is delivered in a very unique way. And it was being translated to people like me, who are kind of the next generation, who really do want to know what's happening there, but maybe can't keep up with, the news channels and things like that and parse out opinion from fact. Like, it's such an important way to connect the diaspora to Pakistan. It's such a valuable way to keep everybody informed. That seems like something like one rich uncle can just get behind and fund, and that's all it would take. And yet somehow we don't really have that path, right? Like, we don't really have access to philanthropy or even like VC that would allow us to make these ventures thrive. And I think also it's so like hard because of the nature of social media in general and the state of journalism to monetize any of this stuff. But it's not super expensive what you're talking about, right? It's not $1 million budget.
Yeah, I'll actually, related to that, I'll share a brief story. So I was just talking to this Pakistani VC a while ago, and it wasn't in the context of me asking for funding. I just wanted to interview him for the news run, and he very kindly accepted it. It was a great interview. And then one question he asked me was, how are you going to turn this into $1 billion business? I'm like, well, it can still be a really good business and not have to be a unicorn, right? But then I thought maybe I was just being naive. But that was my first reaction. it could still, like, you could still run a business really well and have a steady revenue stream without having to turn it into $1 billion business. I'm not sure if the both of you agree. Like, how would you have responded to that?
I agree with you. I mean, I think also, yeah, don't sell yourself short, but also I think that there's so many good ideas that don't have to be billion-dollar businesses. Like, right? There can be lean businesses that have pretty low expenses, especially these internet run businesses, and they don't require so much investment, but they produce something incredibly valuable still. The thing is that people don't value news as a commodity that they'll pay for, right? And so this is kind of a losing business proposition to begin with. And you're like, okay, how do I pair this with something people will pay for? Will they pay for advertising, eyeballs, whatever? But that doesn't mean it's not valuable. And I don't know if that's just the moment we're in right now, where news is kind of struggling to find its business model, or if this is just how it'll be from this point on. But yeah.
I think this has to do with more to do with our community than the broader news ecosystem. And I want to have this conversation here because there's practically no one else in our community that can have the conversation that we're about to have now. But transparently speaking, and I don't know the exact numbers on them, you can correct me, but I think that at $5,000 a month, you could have run and taken NewsRun to the next level if somebody was sort of giving you $5,000 to be able to run at least the basics, and then you could build on top of that. And that's 5 decently rich uncles contributing $1,000 a month. Like, it's not crazy. Like, we're not asking for like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's a travesty that it's not done. And I'm curious, and I feel a little guilty here as well, because I've never gone out and asked a rich uncle yet. I should. Maybe we all should. And like get those no's. Maybe there's presumption on our part as well to say, hey, the community's not ready to support us. And also, like, through this podcast, if anybody is ready to support us, please reach out. But do you think we're afraid of rejection? Like, and I'm just curious, and I'm in your case, like, did you ever go out and sort of, seek to mobilize the community? And I'm wondering, like, and also, like, these are systemic issues. It shouldn't be on the three of us. We're already trying to do so much to also then fix everything for the community. But I'm wondering where things are getting dropped off and how can we, maybe the three of us together, like, push it a little bit further by the time our next year's birthday comes around. Amreen, I mentioned that both of us are turning 1 year younger later this month. So Anam, I don't know. I'm just curious, like, how do you think we can push it one step further?
Good question. I might not have the best answer for it right now, but I think I try to rally the community around the news run by having the option for people to donate to our Patreon account if they're enjoying the news run and would like to contribute to its mission and, help it continue running. I mean, I didn't actually word it like that, but I basically framed it in a way where they were helping the news run function day to day so that people, like our readers and the people donating could continue enjoying or following like all the hard work we were doing. And there were some people who did contribute, and then in exchange I gave them like a custom made poster or just a wallpaper gift in exchange for their donation. But I feel like that didn't really gain a lot of traction in the end. I think a part of it is also now that we're having this conversation, maybe I wasn't reaching out to the right people. I feel like I didn't really know who to reach out to. And I also didn't want to, I think I also didn't want to position the news run as something that was like a charity, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think I really answered your question.
No, you did actually, because I feel a lot of that. I know Amreen was going to say something. Amreen, you go first.
Oh, I heard what you just said, and it reminded me of something. You didn't want to position it as a charity. And the thing is, it's really hard to ask people for money. It's hard for everybody, but it probably culturally is extra hard for us because that's not really a thing you're supposed to do. Like it feels a little bit like, right? Like I could hear my parents being like, well, we don't need other people's help. Like there's a cultural attitude you'd have to fight a little bit before you're like pounding the pavement saying like, this is worth it. You should pay me for this. Like my friends should pay me for this. Everybody should pay. Like it's a little bit awkward because our culture is very much about giving to people and giving more than you receive, right? In some ways, like I wonder if there's a little bit of a cultural attitude you just touched on.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like it might be, but I didn't really know how. I think I didn't know how people were going to respond or react. And again, it's also just I had limited capacity and resources. I didn't have enough time to think about who I could reach out to or grow like my network of journalists or like anyone who might be interested in contributing to a news organization. So I guess I don't want to say that's not possible. Maybe I just didn't have the opportunity to do that as much as I should have.
I think between the culture and the fear, I think it's real, and this is helping me like unlock another insight, which is oftentimes I can get anxious about working on Pehchaan, and I want to move a lot faster, but I get anxious, and the anxiety slows me down. And the reason why I think I'm actually anxious in the context of this conversation is like I'm too afraid to ask and get rejected. And so I don't ask. And so I slow down things. And I'm like, first this will happen, and then that'll happen, and then I'll ask. Um, and that moment never comes. And so it's like a cycle that you're trapped in. And we're too afraid, like culturally and personally, to be like, okay, fine. Like, let's just find out if the community doesn't want us. Like, let's just find out and move on. But this is almost harder to sort of go through. And I don't know if either of you feel any anxiety. I don't know, and this is gonna get real, but I don't know, Amreen, if you feel any anxiety when it comes to sort of working on Central Desi or Anam, like when you were working on the NewsRun, like when it came to like you realizing whether there's going to be traction or not, like was anxiety something that you felt as you sort of moved around it?
Yeah, I think whatever you describe is pretty relatable. And also anxiety around being rejected. I feel like that is something I did experience a lot. And it could have also been what inhibited me in the long run. But I do understand how you're feeling if this is how you're feeling while running your news operation as well.
Yeah, I don't know about anxiety, but I think I know that from the beginning, I am just realizing because of this conversation now, I kind of told myself the community will never pay for this. So I have to find funding somewhere else. So I started applying for grants and I ended up getting a grant, like a media grant to run it. Um, so it's like maybe I immediately just kind of took that challenge off the table because I told myself I'm not even going to try to explore the possibility of the community backing it because I had these like conceptions in my mind that this is not a community that pays for things that feel like extra. This is not a community that's going to, pay for this new subscription. I made a lot of assumptions, and maybe some of those assumptions were there to protect me from having to do the hard work of finding out whether they were true or not. Um, but I think it is, it takes me back a little bit to what you just said earlier, Anam, about being a perfectionist, because I can really relate to that too. And I feel that part of the challenge when you're creating for your own community, and you probably feel this, Bilal, with this podcast, is your friends are watching this, presumably, like probably your frenemies are watching this, like all the people that we know are like curious what we're doing. And you kind of can feel like an invisible judgment almost, right? And you're like, this is something I'm producing for my community. How is my community going to take this? I don't know if for you, like Anam, for example, if I tried to do what you did, I feel like in my head, I would be thinking, my dad probably thinks I'm stupid and I don't know what I'm talking about. And all of this, like I'm pretending I understand Pakistani news and I don't, like that feeling of insecurity about, how am I being perceived? I think that might extend to the funding piece of it too, like feeling confident in being able to say to people, like, this is something that you should back. I don't know. There's a question in there somewhere, but mostly it's just a reflection of what we've been talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I felt pretty confident about what I think the news run has to offer, but I was also I had also convinced myself that I don't know if people are gonna pay for this. They read free news. They can access it anywhere else. Why would they pay for this? And especially, I think that there are other technical complications with paying for things like online in Pakistan, which is where a large part of our user base was, because I think that still not everyone is comfortable paying for things online. Sometimes credit cards don't even work online properly. I've had a credit card in Pakistan to this like for years. It's just not working online. No matter what I do or how many times I call the bank, it just does not work. So I feel like that. I think I'd also just yeah, in a way, and Breen, this is kind of similar to what you said. I feel like I just wasn't. I was confident about the news run and the quality and the value it was providing, but I was not confident that people were going to go out of their way to pay to receive the news. Or,
Mhm.
and I feel like I didn't have a wide enough network to like ask people to support the cause that meant so much to me, like,
Mhm.
to sustain it if there was not going to be a paywall.
So I think as part of this conversation, I might have cracked a business model for YouTube, which is I should pay for therapy to YouTube because this is really helping me out. So I'm going to ask one more, maybe like a little bit of commentary and then a question. There's another angle to it, which I was also sort of exploring, which is prior to doing Pehchaan, I used to do a lot of political reporting in videos, and those videos used to get like million plus views, hundreds and thousands of views, get sort of covered everywhere. I was on TV, and then I was like, but I didn't like who I was becoming because I was becoming sort of, a more caricature version of myself. And then I was like, Pehchan is the first thing that I created for myself where I was like, this is something that I would want to listen to. And then I realized like it's getting hundreds of views versus millions of views. And now my daughter's also trying to enter this room and interrupt this conversation. But as I went through that journey, I was like, is this a rejection of me and like what I want? Like
Mhm.
I'm putting, and I'm not a perfectionist, like unlike you two. I'm like, I just want to put it out there because the anxiety is like, I'm just like, get it out there. So I try to be perfect and I can't. It's too much anxiety. So I'm like, just throw whatever's coming like out there and it'll get better over time. But I'm sort of swinging in that journey, and then there's a part of me, Anam, that's like at the beginning stages of what you were thinking with the news run, like where I was like, okay, how much more time do I need to give this? Like another season, 2 years? At what point will I know? And the truth is, like, there's no way to know. There's no right or wrong answer. But I'm curious for your take, which is like, when did you know? This is why I started the podcast, actually, because I was like, I don't know the answers to my identity, but I want to figure them out for her. So it's ironic that she's making an entry at this point. But how
Hello.
did you know that it was time to move on from the news run? And sorry for such a loaded question.
I think it was a lot of factors. One, I was burning out mentally because the news run was taking up so much time in the evening after work, and during the day I was doing my full-time job. So I was just working nonstop from like 8 a.m. to like 11 p.m. and then I would get ready for bed. And
Mhm.
I that didn't seem sustainable because I wanted some work-life balance. I needed some time to decompress. So I was just really tired. And then on top of that, I thought that I'm too tired to really think about how to make this business model work. So it doesn't make sense to just stop and reflect on that. Or should I just keep powering ahead and see what happens? And then the latter didn't seem like a feasible option. So that's why I thought, I've given this a chance for a few years. I still think it's capable of going somewhere, but I need to give myself time to really think about how I want to make this work in the long term. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, it's been almost a year now, so I clearly do not have an answer yet. But and I think that's also because again, like my work is keeping me so busy and just other life commitments. But in the back of my mind, I do still want to keep the news run alive. I just haven't figured out the best path forward for it yet.
Well, it makes me wonder. I mean, it sounds like your answer to that is that you basically got to a point where it was unsustainable, right? Like working from 8 to 11 is unsustainable. And then your body was like, okay, you got to stop. But what would make it sustainable? Like, what would it take for you to be able to run the news run? Would it be being able to basically supplant maybe your day job salary with the ability to work on the news run, or is it something short of that? Maybe you've done some of that reflection in the last year. Like, how could it possibly kind of work that you wouldn't burn out?
Well, I think more funding and more people helping me, and me just being at a point where like I can have an advisory role or like sit on a board or something and oversee it, not really get involved in day-to-day editorial work, but just like broadly oversee the quality of the content and the stories we're producing, but without having to do the nitty-gritty hands-on work every day. And then also, if like I could be pulled in for any sponsorship or brand partnership opportunities without
Mm.
having to actively call people, email people, and seek that out myself every day. I feel like that. So it's a combination of, yeah, more people and also more money to operate the news run so that I can hire a high quality talented team of people to work on the news run. Uh,
Mm.
but again, this also goes back to me burning out and burning out while also feeling like I was hitting a wall.
Mm.
Uh, so
It's an interesting answer because I've arrived to the same point with Central Desi, which is I feel like I should be kind of the business side of it and kind of work on the sustainability and hire a team that can run it. But truly, I created it because I enjoyed storytelling and I liked being a reporter and I liked being the person that got to write the stories. So it's funny that you kind of say the same thing because you loved doing the news run, right? And the actual act of it. But what you're describing is that maybe you wouldn't be doing it. You'd be an advisor and you'd be kind of helping run it. Um, what do you
yeah,
think about that? The fact that that's a little bit disconnected.
yeah, it is a bit contradictory, but I think it's probably the most realistic way I can
Mm.
manage news run at this point. At some, I do like writing, but I feel like I have so many other commitments that I would have to probably give that role to somebody else while still staying involved with the news run. So in some sense, I feel like I'd be getting the best of both.
Mhm.
And I'd also explored or thought about maybe having somebody else or another publication acquire the news run, and I
Mm.
partner with them to some extent so that they
Mhm.
could use their resources to operate the news run and their teams or like whatever writing or editorial resources they have available to sustain it, and I could still come along for the ride but maybe not be involved in working on it day to day. But then at least that would also keep me connected to the news run somehow at the same time so that it's still something that's a part of my life.
Yeah.
Uh, so
That makes a lot of sense to me. Like, why wouldn't Dawn or the news or somebody want to make this like their digital play or their play in terms of reaching the diaspora and kind of widening their audience? It does seem like there's a lot of business cases to be made that that could be a good entity to take this on because, as we were pointing out, it actually doesn't take that much money to run it if you already have a media infrastructure behind it. Have you tried that or have you considered maybe going that route?
no, I hadn't really looked into that yet. I also don't really know who to reach out to, to be
Yeah.
honest.
That's where the state of journalism comes in, Amreen. So that's where your macro sort of point comes in. I don't think Pakistani news platforms have the vision or the financial muscle to do something like that. I think it has to be a commercial commercially viable product, for lack of a better word. But I do think that that's where this is like an interesting reflection of the community, where we have a very sizable diaspora. And even in the US, there's a very significant Pakistani American community that's relatively wealthy. And I'm surprised that we are not creating enough, like beyond an UPNA conference where everybody can, like all the uncles and aunties can feel like they're, back at their Dow Medical College days in the 80s and serving like bun kebabs all night. Like beyond that, we haven't really produced something as a community that can actually nurture sort of the next generation of Pakistani Americans, or keep sort of Pakistani Americans connected to Pakistan. And it's sad. I don't want to make this like a sad fest. We'll make it happy towards the end. But I'm like, it's a reflection. And then everybody complains that, their kids have moved away from Pakistan, they're not connected, and they don't know how to, like, connect them to their roots. And I'm like, kind of like, you can see the
Right?
straight
Yeah.
line.
I don't know if we're just crazy, like the three of us, or maybe we are like the cusp of the trend that is trying to change that, trying to evolve the community into something else. Because, you're right, there's a sizable diaspora. We are still a relatively new diaspora, and I think people like me who grew up in the United States are kind of proof that there is value in having a connection to the homeland, that your parents and your families come from. My kids have a tremendous curiosity about Pakistan. I was trying to explain Pakistani politics to them last night, and they're quite young, but to me, I feel like there is such an opportunity to be creating those threads and those connections, but our community like isn't really doing it yet. But we're trying, and so maybe we are part of something that it's hard for us to see might be bigger than us and might be more developed. Maybe in 5 to 10 years, like we'll realize these are kind of the early days of us kind of creating this for the community. That's a kind of an optimistic take on it, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I think at some point it became more than just staying connected with the community. Like as I worked on the NewsRun for longer, I really wanted to try to cover stories that weren't getting mainstream media coverage, like not like outside of just political drama. We're also used to like issues that minority communities are facing, women's issues, human rights issues, things that are really hard to find in reliable news sources. And it sometimes it's hard to trust everything you read on social media either. So at some point I was thinking, oh, it would be so great if I had a team on the ground that could fact check these stories that I'm reading bits and pieces of on social media to see if this is something that we should report. Just like try to surface stories that don't get the attention they deserve. But then again, you need a bigger team for that. You need resources. You also have to make sure that you're sending your team to places that are safe and then like keep their security in mind.
Yeah.
So it's that was also like a long-term dream. Just helping people in Pakistan and the diaspora outside of Pakistan get exposure to these really important issues and stories that they're probably not reading in mainstream media outlets like Dawn or the Express Tribune or the news, for example.
Yeah, actually, now that you say that, I'm thinking about, I think it was when the Aurat March had happened in Karachi, but I remember receiving like issues of the NewsRun where you were talking about trans issues and things that I really had felt like never had gotten media coverage in Pakistani news in a fair way. And it really was what piqued my interest because I was like, oh, this feels like a Western news product in some ways, but reporting on Pakistan. And I think you probably tapped into something there that could really use a lot of like, I think could grow pretty quickly if you continued on that path. I'm glad you call it a hiatus because I feel like you're doing a lot of thinking about what's next for it. And hopefully you'll find a way through this moment. Like, hopefully this isn't the end of the news run, because in the whole year that you haven't been doing it, it's not like someone stepped in to fill that void, right? Like, nothing else exists like it still.
Not that I know of, no.
Yeah. If the three of us don't know about it, it doesn't exist. But I like the way that you put that, Amreen. And usually, Anam, for your record, usually I'm the optimist and Amreen is the skeptical one. And in this
That's
podcast, we've
true.
reversed roles. That shows how much I've sort of been touched or moved. But I do think that we are trailblazers for the community in sort of this space, and I do think that in the end we will find a way to crack models that will work. I wish it was easier, but I do think that what we have now that we perhaps didn't is this kind of a community beginning to build. And I'm sure there are others like us sort of that are around in the community. And I think it's about finding them and nurturing and building that, because those are sort of the change agents within the broader community that can sort of lift and change things.
Yeah, and it
Wow.
sounds like we need like a foundation or something, like somebody to help us funnel that money through, right? Like, sounds like that infrastructure needs to be built.
Yeah. That too. Anam, I wanna maybe like the last question from my side is sort of taking this in terms of, you talked about how the newsrun helped you professionally, but I want to talk a little bit about how it helped you personally, if it did, in terms of who you are as a human being and your identity now. Originally you said you wanted it to do it to stay connected to Pakistan. Now it's became a lot more than that. But how has it changed you and your identity, working on the newsrun for as long as you did, being connected to Pakistan the way that you did? How do you think it's influenced you or changed you?
I think that it helped me become more proficient and being able to detect news that might not be completely accurate or fact checked properly. I feel like I have a radar that goes off now when I think I'm reading something that might be fake news. I question things more. I don't believe everything I read online. I kind of have a system in my mind where I try to cross-reference news stories across various sources. If I see something emerging on social media, I'll see if it's being consistently reported on elsewhere, or if they're activists or people who are thought leaders in that area talking about the same thing, to see if there's some truth to it. So I feel like it's helped me become more news and media literate. And I thought that I was that before, but I feel like I've become much more responsible about how I retain the news and what sources I look at and what I read. And now, for example, if I get like a WhatsApp forward or something's trending on X, which was formerly Twitter, I stop myself and think, okay, does this actually sound believable? Let's just see what's going on. Let's investigate this more before I start distributing this news elsewhere to other people. So I think that's one way I've grown a lot, like as a news reader, and how I think the news run has helped me.
I'm curious, on the same note about the personal piece of this, like, you talked about the news run being kind of one way that you were connected to what was happening in Pakistan. Absent that, for the last period since you've been on a hiatus, how have you felt about your connection to Pakistan or your ability to nurture that? Are you feeling more grounded in your American identity than you did, say, a year or two ago? Or are you feeling, is there still kind of a tension there that you feel like you need to solve? Or have you come to kind of peace with kind of being this hybrid?
I feel like there's still a little bit of tension. Like I acknowledge that I'm not really on top of what's happening back home anymore. And now when people ask me, they're like, oh, okay, what's happening in Pakistan right now? What should we know? I'm like, well, I've been working on the news run, so I don't really have a lot of detail to share with you, other than just like glancing at some articles here and there and skimming them over. But so like I feel like my my connection to Pakistan isn't as deep as it was when I was working on the news run. Like I still care about the things that are happening there, but I feel like I don't like I don't know as much as I did before in terms of like all the context behind what's happening and the nitty-gritty details about uh certain developments that are taking place, especially when it comes to what's happening with the election right now. So, and then I just don't feel as plugged in. I think that's the simplest way to say it. And the newsrun really helped me do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. But does that have an impact then on your sense of identity in any way, your Pakistani identity, or?
I wouldn't say that. No, I feel like my identity feels intact. I'm just trying to separate my identity from the news so that I feel less guilty about not being on top of things as much as I used to be.
Actually, that's a very powerful thing that you just said. I want to unpack that for a second. Do you think, forget the news for a second, do you think your identity had become too intertwined with the news run that everybody saw you as the news run? And then when you stopped the news run, you were like, who am I? Or people were like, who are you? Because I'm like, okay, what if I stop Pehchaan? What if I stop being public? Like, will people be like, who is he? Like, I don't know. Or will I ask myself, who am I? Did that happen?
No, I think that was more internal. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think so. I'm usually not a very public person.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Even though there are some people on my team who really wanted me to be, and they really said, "Oh, you should become the face of the news run." But it's just not me. Like I didn't want
Mm-hmm.
to be the face of the news run. I just wanted people to see the news run as this online digital news resource that gives them smart breakdowns of Pakistan's top news. I didn't want my identity tied to it publicly, but I think I internally tied my identity to it more
Hmm.
instead of like having people automatically just associate me with the news run. I mean, sometimes I tried putting myself out there and I did some interviews for publications and I was a guest on some other podcast just to try to market the news run, but like it's very much me coming out of my comfort zone.
One thing I didn't get to ask you or haven't yet is about just being a woman and running the news run. And I know that you didn't really make it publicly apparent who was publishing it, right? So it wasn't necessarily easy to find out unless you did some digging, as I did. I found you. Um, but did being a woman ever feel like either helpful or an impediment in what you were doing? And did that ever become a factor? Because I just think, in Pakistani culture, we have an idea of kind of the role of women, and it's different. There's plenty of women in news broadcast and things like that. So this is kind of a different industry, but just curious if that ever kind of, yeah, either impacted your work in either way.
I don't think it did. Or maybe it did and I just didn't realize it. But I feel like it was really hard to tell who was running the news run unless people really went out of their way to check. But it was just funny how I noticed that sometimes people assumed it was a man because when we would
Yeah.
get emails, they would always start with
Oh,
"Dear
wow.
Sir." And then I was like, well, I don't know. I automatically assume there's a guy behind this, but okay.
That's funny. That's funny, not surprising, but very funny. Hmm.
And both the deer and the sir are very Pakistani. So that's fascinating.
Hmm.
All right. I don't even know how to end this, which I guess is the point that this is the beginning, not the end of what the three of us can eventually do. But I think this is such if I want to get really meta, I guess, there's a moment right now where I'm questioning Pehchaan and sort of I see the newsrun's experience and then I'm like, well, where else could a conversation like this have happened? Nowhere. Like we could not have had this on a public platform to talk about how hard it is for people within the community to build something for the community. And so at least that part gives me hope that there's a space to have a conversation like this. And I hope that as more people see this, and as you know, there's catharsis for us also to be able to build a community like this, that the next generation of us does better, but also us in our next iteration are able to find each other and that support through each other to do big things. Because if we're not going to do it, clearly there's not a lot of other people doing it, so we've got to step up as well.
Yeah, and I think by putting this online, we would create the opportunity, Bilal, for other people to watch it and say, I'm interested in this, or hey, I'm also building something and I should get in touch with these people. Like, just putting it out in the world is valuable, I think. And, we're all trying to put our stamp on things in some way or another, whether our experiments continue or don't, or life gets in the way or other things come up. We all have other jobs and things like that. I think that the calling piece of this is not going to go away, right? And so we're either going to have to listen to that, or we're going to torture ourselves by ignoring it the rest of our lives. So either way, I think it's good that we try, even if it doesn't feel like success. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we still have to try.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. And thank you for also giving me an opportunity to talk about the news run in so much detail. It's been a while, and like I miss talking about it. So thank you for listening.
I remember at the beginning of this podcast, and you were like, I'm a little rusty on the news run and I'm not sure. And I'm like, we'll get there. There's a lot of trauma here that's going to come out. But I'm glad we did this, and I'm really happy we had the conversation that we did. And I wonder where we'll all be a year from now and 5 years from now, and where the community will be. So that's exciting. All right, I'm going to stop record, but it'll be great if you both can just stay on for a minute.